Watch MBT, it has a good discussion. I could live with that.
Pendulum. Pendulums were invented in the year 1 AD, when a man named Fuko famously quipped, "Special summoning is much like a prison." Alright, today we're talking about these cards. I know I'm one of Yu-Gi-Oh's biggest haters, but for some reason I have a soft spot in my heart for pendulums. I've played pretty much every pendulum archetype, and taken a significant amount of them to high-level tournaments. I didn't do so good, though. So why do I want...
I want to just say, before we even watch the video, Pendulum feels weird to me recently. Because, or like in recent years, it's not a very recent thing. It's just the last couple of years. I've always been, Pendulum has either been irrelevant or toxic. I feel like most of the time. It's like whenever a Pendulum deck sees play, it's usually not very pleasant to play against most of the time. The only exception that I can think of is like very, very old Pendulum decks, like Metal Foes, for example, right? Like very, 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 very back in the day. Like I'm talking 2017, 2016 had some cool Pendulum decks. Recently, bro, I don't even remember a recent cool Pendulum deck. Like the Draco Slayer deck was almost okay, design-wise. The Draco Slayer deck was almost okay, but that's that. All the things that you guys are mentioning are not toxic, right? Valence and stuff like that. They're not toxic, but they are also not good, right? They're sadly not very strong, right? So like those are the only two categories I feel like that Pendulums go in, because it's just a very hard to design around mechanic. Anyways, that's probably what the video is about anyway. So
I want to talk about Pendulum today. Well, as Draco Slayer dribbles into Master Duel, more individuals than ever are experimenting with these weird cards that are sometimes monsters but sometimes spells. This is happening at the same time a larger discussion is brewing among potential new players about how complex Yu-Gi-Oh is, and for a lot of those players, Pendulums are the poster child for that complexity. I'd like to spend today talking about Pendulum as a noun, the archetype, what it means for Yu-Gi-Oh,
The only thing that I always thought was confusing about Pendulum is that when they first came out, and let me know if I'm the only one here. When Pendulum first came out and they announced how it was going to work, I thought you had to put the lower scale on the left side and the higher scale on the right side. And I thought there was going to be cards that had a different number on the left side and then another number on the right side. And then depending on where you would put them, it would be either treated as the high scale or the low scale, depending on which side you would put that on. And I was very confused and very annoyed by learning that every single Pendulum card has two numbers on it, but that doesn't really matter because it's always going to be the same. Like it's always an 8 scale, for example. It's never like different on the left side or on the right side, which arguably, I'm going to be honest with you, it's probably better that way because it would have been more confusing even, right? If they did it that way, if like every card has two different scales depending on whether they're on the left side or the right side or whatever, it would have just been even more complicated. So it's probably better this way, all right? Maybe that's what they thought they were gonna do, and then they changed it, maybe. But I remember distinctly being confused by, like, I thought that if you put like a 5 on the left side and then a 3 on the right side, you couldn't Pendulum summon because the left side was gonna be the low scale. That's what I thought in the beginning. But anyways.
Specific design issues it presents and how Konami can circumvent those in the future. And we're gonna do our best not to play the one Triff clip over and over again.
Anyone with a brain would realize it was a joke.
In short, let's talk about the problem with Pendulum. Breaking this shit into 4 sections. First section is complexity. So discussion of Pendulum has to begin with their genesis in the set that changed everything, Duelist Alliance. At the time that this released, Yu-Gi-Oh! Was doing fine. Yu-Gi-Oh's always doing fine. We have a really easy time retaining players, but a really hard time getting new players in. So when a new series starts, that's a unique opportunity to potentially simplify the game to a state at which players now feel that they can get into it. And for what it's worth, Duelist Alliance did a lot right. Sure, the decks that were released were complex in a way that cards had not been in the past, but they were also super fun, played at wall combo speeds, functionally reset the metagame, and
The very early Pendulum times, I will say, up until it was either up until Pepe or after they already nuked Pepe, there was a lot of like cool Pendulum strategies, like Odd Eyes Pendulum, that the one that I brought to, I think it was 2016 Euros, I thought was pretty cool. I'm pretty sure that was before Pepe. When was Pepe? 2016? I'm pretty sure that was before Pepe.
introduced the pace of play that we enjoy today with decks like Shadal and Burning Abyss, which are still occasionally playable. What, 8 years later? 9 years? Let me just go on Glasgow Yu-Gi-Oh's YouTube. Previously, each new summoning mechanic had of course led to waves of boomers claiming that this was the end for Yu-Gi-Oh! And they were stepping away. Synchros, as there's now this addition in my game?
Bro, Glasgow Yu-Gi-Oh! Was the worst. I'm glad he's not making content anymore.
I have to add up numbers? Xyz, where do the materials go? Too difficult to understand. But Pendulum was the first time that there was actually meat to the argument. See, these are really complex to explain to new players. If you're unfamiliar, Pendulum Monsters have both a monster effect and a scale effect. These effects can be activated while it's put into one of two Pendulum Zones, which were added to the board with the release of this set and Master Rule 3. Once per turn, you can perform a Pendulum Summon, during which you can summon any number of monsters from your hand or face-up extra deck with a level between the two numbers on your pendulum scales. That's right, the face-up extra deck also exists now. When a pendulum card is destroyed, it is not sent to the graveyard, but is in fact returned to the top of the extra deck, at which point it can be pendulum summoned on a future turn. That explanation is difficult, but it's the tip of an iceberg of super unintuitive discussions and rulings. Pendulum cards are both monsters and spell traps depending on what position or location they are in. That means that cards that interact with spells or monsters will have different applications based on how the pendulum card is being played. Replacement effects for moving location, like those on Dimensional Fissure, do override Pendulum's ability to go to the face-up extra deck because those cards have an innate replacement effect that applies when they would go to the graveyard, though they are not doing so. The numbers are weird. There's two of them, which implies that at some point there would be one with two different numbers. Otherwise, why would you put two numbers on it? But there never was. It was always just the same number twice. The pendulum zones themselves were really weird. They're not spell and trap card zones. They're locations that you can put additional cards if your hand is too full. What's the point? Oh, and if you have a mat that existed before 2014, sorry, it doesn't work anymore. The most frustrating part of all of this is, despite this complexity, there was a ton of design space just sort of left on the cutting room floor. Pendulum decks early did one thing and one thing only: summon a bunch of monsters to perform a big monster combo. The fear among players is that this would eventually result in a deck that was exclusively starters and extenders, all of which had pendulum scales, which leads me to 2. It's a big club and you're not in it. So famously, Konami employee and designer of the best Yu-Gi-Oh! Product ever conceived, rest in peace Matt Bell, we hardly knew ye, claimed that one of the issues with Pendulum was every new Pendulum design had the potential to be a part of this big Pendulum soup archetype that contained only the good cards from 6 or 7 years of card design. Functionally, Pendulum was one big archetype, and any new Pendulum card could be played within it. That makes designing cards really difficult. When the Pendulum cards first released in Duelist Alliance, Konami was originally very scared about them. This can be seen with the Cleefort monsters. This first playable series of Pendulum monsters all have text on them that prevents you from special summoning anything but Cleeforts. You're not going to be accessing anything other than the monsters that this archetype contains. This was a type of effect that not only had never been seen before, it had not been designed around in previous sets. Because you could theoretically special summon any monster from your hand, a whole bunch of monsters that were balanced around needing to be tribute summoned suddenly weren't. The player base was scared about this too, and early attempts to break Pendulum mostly revolved around cheating out really powerful 1 or 2 tribute monsters.
I will say, I don't think that is a problem about a mechanic. Like, yes, it's absolutely, it's true that if you make a new mechanic, suddenly old cards can become very problematic because they were not designed with that mechanic in mind. Another great example of when a lot of cards ended up being way too busted because they made tokens, right? All of the cards that created tokens were big problems. Not all the cards that created tokens, but a lot of the cards that created tokens were a problem once Link Monsters came out, right? And all that means is that you can still make that mechanic. You can make the Link mechanic. You just have to adjust your game a little bit, right? Because, you know, just remove those cards that are now problematic, right? That is a thing. They should have probably done that a little bit more carefully at the release of Links, right? Because certain cards like Grinder Golem or something were just around for, I think, a little bit too long until they realized, or until they were like, yeah, okay, now it's time to go, right? But overall, I still think that's not at all a KO criteria for like, oh, you cannot make this mechanic because it makes some of the old cards now problematic. I don't think that's necessarily the case, it just means that you have to revisit those old cards, right? But that, surprisingly to me, it was always something that I was worried about with Pendulum, you know, the fact that you could Pendulum summon any card from your hand, right? I was very concerned in the beginning of Pendulum, like when was that, 8 years ago, 7.5 years ago, I don't remember exactly. I was concerned that decks were just going to use those as like ways to special summon all the cards out of their hand, right? Decks that would previously maybe be clunky and not able to 9 years ago, Jesus Christ, I'm old. Okay, 9 years ago, my bad. That like every deck was just able to splash a couple scales and then special summon all their stuff from their hand, right? But that like never happened, right? It's never, or like at least I don't remember a lot of decks that just randomly played a couple Pendulum scales. It was always either a full Pendulum deck or no Pendulum cards at all, usually. The only exception was actually, I think, that I can think of now is Super Heavy Samurai, and that is like 2 months ago. Every other like deck would not be able to play just a small amount of Pendulums, which I think is okay. Lunalight did play Pendulums, but Lunalight didn't really Pendulum summon, right? Because they only played Tiger, right? That's not what I mean. That's not what I mean. I mean like a regular deck, like I don't know, just a regular Yu-Gi-Oh deck, splashing Pendulum cards for the sake of special summoning, for the sake of getting extenders, and it just turns out that like that wasn't really good ever, because if you don't reach critical mass of Pendulum cards in a deck, you will not consistently draw Pendulum scales, right? You will simply not draw them in the right combination, because if you want to use Pendulum scales as extenders, you have to draw low scale, high scale, plus monsters that you want to summon. It's just very, very unlikely if you only play a couple Pendulum cards, right? So it turned out that most of the time it was just basically full Pendulum decks, right? That would play Pendulum cards. You would only very rarely sometimes see splashable Pendulum cards. Like one that I can think of is Archfiend Eccentric, which was just a generically good card. That was also very cool design, by the way. Archfiend Eccentric at the time was one of my favorite card designs ever, because it was a very flexible form of removal, and a very, in my opinion, a very cool design, like use of the Pendulum mechanic, right? The fact that you just made it a card where the Pendulum scale didn't really matter that much in most decks. It was just the idea of you can use this card as a spell card or as a monster card is something that I wish they would have done more with Pendulum, right? I wish they would have done a couple more just generically good Pendulum cards, not even necessarily good in Pendulum decks, because Archfiend Eccentric in Pendulum decks wasn't anything special. Like some decks used it, but for the most part, it wasn't that great. It was just a cool utility card, which I think they could have done more often, honestly, with cards like that. I wish they did that more rather than just design one pendulum archetype after the other. Just like more like another pendulum archetype, another pendulum archetype, another pendulum archetype. And these days, most pendulum archetypes are even like very restricted to the point that they can only be used with themselves, right? Or at least in a very specific environment, which is good for balancing, but it makes it feel like there's just 1,000 different pendulum archetypes that are all somewhat similar. Of course, they're doing slightly different things, but the end goal for most pendulum decks is relatively similar, so...
This fear would eventually be realized with a significant series of ARG format tops in which the Ignite monsters were used to pendulum summon stuff like Jinzo. In the grand scheme of things, that's not particularly powerful, but you gotta understand this was at a time when Satellar Knight was a top deck. But you can't just print a Xenolock on every new piece of archetypal support forever. So eventually, Konami relented. By the time the first of Pendulum's Tier 0 formats manifested in Performapal Pendulum, there were almost no locks to speak of, and one of the most powerful things you could be doing was pendulum summoning a bunch of 4-star monsters and overlaying for a Shockmaster. Or in America, Hope Harbinger? We were just material. It was just, you could make anything. Eventually, this became the norm for Pendulum Monsters. A Pendulum deck was one that set scales, Pendulum summoned out a bunch of monsters, and then made a bunch of powerful extra deck monsters that weren't necessarily intended to be made with the infinite number of material you could get for just performing a combo that put bodies on board. Metal Foes, Pendulum Magician, Endymion, all of these decks looked pretty similar if you squinted. Nowadays, there's one thing that Pendulum decks do. They perform a big-ass monster combo and then use the nigh infinite material that they've summoned as a result of their setup to make a bunch of generic extra deck monsters. The fears of Konami and the community have come to pass in the way that modern Pendulum decks operate. Oh, cool, you made Apollosa, Baron. Oh my god, you're setting up a Dagdaline. Oh! Be still my beating...
Does he know Scythe is banned? Does he know the best card you can set off of Dagda is Moral Tack?
Heart. After
Pepe, or is it?
there...
I guess it might be catered towards. It might be catered towards Massadul audience. That's fair.
There were a couple of historical outliers to this type of pendulum gameplay, but they were bad for a different reason. Oh, in 2016 NAWCQ format, you could play Cleafort Demise, using the pendulum scales as holding facilities, so you could card of Demise turn 1 without having to pitch anything. Hooray. Which leads me to gameplay. This is 3. Gameplay. Not only is playing against Pendulum an insomnia cure, playing with Pendulum often feels really bad too. Because performing a Pendulum summon requires you to have both a low scale and a high scale, you kind of have to kajigger your deck in such a way that you are almost always going to be drawing one apiece. Sure, some decks are more consistent than others and have the ability to, through one card, set up both ends of a scale with something like a Pendulum Call, but even then it behooves you to have as many monsters in hand as possible to perform your long-ass combo board you saw on a YouTube video. As a result, you often don't have too much space for non-engine cards. Like, you're not going to be able to Pendulum summon out an Abiru or a Drolan Lockbird, and Book of Moon is just a card that could have been a monster for your big, silly combo. So as a result, even if you are piloting Pendulum frequently, you're just staring at your opponent waiting for them to finish their combo and hoping your hand can include enough gas to beat through it.
I mean, it's just, this is not generically, I don't think this is a Pendulum problem per se. That's a very, it's like a combo deck issue that we're talking about here. Like the core gameplay loop of heavy combo decks these days is not super enjoyable. At least I think the majority of the community thinks that. There's probably people out there who disagree, as there always are. But this is there's like this, you know, it's just like another flavor of, you know, super heavy samurai, Vanadium, whatever. Pendulum decks are just that, right? But slightly different, right? So in that sense, I don't think Pendulum is more or less problematic than combo decks in general, right? It does seem to be hard, though. It does seem to be hard, or at least Konami has not been able to really do that. It seems to be hard to make a balanced, mid-rangey Pendulum strategy these days. It doesn't seem like that's something that they are capable of doing. And I think the reason for that is that the pendulum strategy inherently needs to be broken, I feel like. Because think about it this way. When you're setting scales, right? You're setting a low scale and you're setting a high scale. Those are typically just you're just being down 2 cards, right? You're down 2 cards, and those cards typically don't do anything on your opponent's turn. There's exceptions where the scales will give you something on your opponent's turn, right? They'll have some sort of effect, but most of the time pendulum scales will be they'll just sit there, right? They just sit there in the scales, and you make your board, right? And of course, not every pendulum deck goes -2 to set up their scales. Sometimes you have scales that will find you another scale, like for example, Performer Pal Monkey board, which is it's been a long time since I've even seen that card being played, but like that's an example of just like a 1-card scale. But even then you're going -1 to set up your scales, right? And it's just the nature of the game that when you go down cards deliberately to enable your combo needs to be stronger, right? You can't just spend 2 cards to set up scales and then just do a mid-range combo and expect to win, because you're not going to be able to back up that board that you just made with like extra cards in hand for follow-up or hand traps or whatever, right? A regular pendulum hand cannot consist of like you think of a regular mid-range deck and you're like, okay, that deck can draw like 2 starters and 3 non-engine and they're Gucci, right? A pendulum deck cannot do that. If a pendulum deck draws 3 non-engine, how is it going to set up scales and play the game, right? That's not something it can do, right? Unless you have like a 1-card scale and a 1-card combo if pendulum summoned or something like that, right? It simply isn't something like that. So the pendulum, I think the pendulum archetype in general, the pendulum mechanic, is very vulnerable to this sort of design problem where they've made it in a way where you kind of have to make those cards you have left after setting up scales, they need to make really crazy boards, right? Because if they don't, then why would I go through the hassle of like playing a pendulum deck, setting up scales, if I then don't do anything that's like crazy, right? Like, why would I ever play that? And so I don't know exactly how you would fix it. I think one way to fix it would be to design decks more often that don't revolve around the classic pendulum summoning mechanic, right? You could make use of pendulum cards and the pendulum scale in different ways. Like, for example, I hate to use this as a good example for this, but Cleaford, right? The Cleaford cards themselves, I don't think were badly designed. The Cleaford archetype was fine because it wasn't revolving around actually pendulum summoning very often, right? It was mostly like Cleaford Scout may as well have been a continuous spell, pretty much, but them having the option to pendulum summon sometimes was all right. Cleaford, once again, a deck that people that played back then, people will not love Cleaford. Most of the time don't remember Cleaford as a very healthy archetype. But I think Cleaford was, in itself, a cool pendulum archetype. The only problem with Cleaford was that it synergized so well with Floodgates, right? And that... Now we're going full circle to the discussion of what's the problem. Is it Floodgates or is it the actual archetype that plays the Floodgates? I think the problem is the Floodgates. I don't think the Cleaford cards were anything out of the ordinary, right? Cleaford was like a completely fine deck to play against as long as they didn't flip skill drain or lose 1 turn or whatever they would play, right? Like, it was completely okay to play against Cleaford. And that was that, right? Towers is another different topic. That is one Cleaford card that I don't like the design of. Towers was not great. But in general, Cleaford as a pendulum archetype was pretty fine.
Board, this becomes a huge liability because going first, there's a ton of cards that just read win the game against pendulums. Anti-spell, Dimension Barrier, awesome. So somehow we've ended up in a position where both playing pendulum decks and playing against pendulum decks can be really, really boring. So, 4, how do we fix it?
Endymion was mid-range, was it? Was Endymion a mid-range deck? I don't remember it being that. I don't remember it being that. I feel like that deck would open Servant of Endymion and just set up a freaking whole bunch of Omni Negates. Like, literally, that's another thing. That's another thing that I didn't like about Pendulum, is that they just ended up... I've already done that. I didn't like how they would constantly make more Pendulum Omni Negates, right? Why was the mighty master an Omni Negate? What was it? The Spell and Trap Negate? Why did they make the Mythical Beast Jackal that was just also a 1-card monster negate? Like, why did they just give that deck so many ways of just making such a weird way of giving a deck interaction by just giving it so many negates, right? I didn't like that. Yeah.
Well, here's how we've been trying it so far. We've made them all terrible. These days, newly released Pendulum Monsters are either unplayable garbaggio because Konami is sidestepping around the pendulum problem of one individual deck that contains every single playable archetype.
This might just go back to what we've been talking about in recent streams, of them releasing a lot of cards recently, right? They are releasing cards, I feel like, very frequently these days, which in return means that they have less time to design each and every archetype. And I personally think that Pendulum is probably the hardest archetype to design a deck that is both balanced and also fun. Right? I would imagine that would be the hardest mechanic to build around. Right? Like, if someone tells me, hey, you need to design a cool fusion mechanic, you need to design a cool ritual mechanic or whatever. Those are challenges, but I think you could find a way to do that, right? You could find a way to design a balanced and fun fusion or ritual deck or whatever, or synchro or XYZ or whatever. Like, those decks I think are a little bit easier to design. Pendulum is, I think, a little bit harder than that. A lot harder, probably, to just make a mid-range, good but balanced and fun Pendulum deck, I think, is a lot of work. And it takes a couple people that really know what they're doing when it comes to card design, right? Yeah. They should just give that task to whoever designed, like, Vanquish Soul. Whoever designed Vanquish Soul should just give, they should just give him, like, you know, you have 3 months. You have nothing else to do. We will leave you alone for 3 months. You can lock yourself up in a room. Just come up with a cool Pendulum deck. That's what they should do.
Or their busted-ass novels that have a million words on them, do a million things, and get banned almost immediately. I think this is a great opportunity to think outside the box in terms of Pendulum design. What can Pendulum Monsters be? Why do Pendulum Monsters all have to serve the same purpose monster combo that a bazillion other non-Pendulum monster combo decks do? What makes a Pendulum deck different than a Synchron deck, for instance? And truth be told, I think Konami's not doing a terrible job. The last couple of playable Pendulum archetypes have been different. Abyss Actor, for instance, has to play...
Bro said playable and Abyss Actor in one sentence. That's crazy.
The spells by design. So as a result, they've baked in a lot of one-card combos and enabled you to draw as few pendulums as you want, though still execute a combo. Your end board isn't going to have Apollosa Baron on it, but it is going to be able to interact with your opponent in ways that are, at minimum...
Okay, I'll give it to him that way. I'll give him that. The recent Pendulum archetypes have not been terribly designed in the sense that they did not ruin the game. They did not feel unbalanced. That is true. I think they are just lacking on the playability side, right? That's what I said earlier. It's a deck is either toxic or irrelevant, the Pendulum strategies, right? Also, I mean, freaking Super Heavy Samurai is a big counter argument to this entire thing, right? Super Heavy Samurai was terribly designed. It was awful. So yeah, I think they should lean on more. What they should really do more, in my opinion, is lean on the fact that Pendulum cards in itself have a lot of flexibility to them, right? They are basically, by design, Pendulum cards are very, very flexible because you can either use them as monsters or you can use them as spells, right? And that is maybe something they could lean on a bit more because they've not really been doing that. Most of the Pendulum cards that I can think of are either most of the Pendulum monsters that I can think of right now. You can let me know if you can think of examples that prove me wrong. But most of the Pendulum monsters that I can think of, when you read them for the first time, you really know whether you want it in the scale or as a monster, right? Most cards don't really do both really well. Most cards are just one of the two, right? They either are a really good scale or a really good summon, right? Like Vakaushi needs to be in the scale or whatever. Or like Performapal Pendulum Sorcerer, you read that card and you know immediately, okay, that thing needs to be Pendulum Summoned. It doesn't really do well as a scale. It's not really a good scale. They're just putting any scale effect on it just so it's playable as a scale, but it's not really giving you flexibility. It's like a very bad scale, but a very good monster on the board, right? And like, I think they could lean on that flexibility a little bit more, right? Just like give cards like good scale effects, but also good monster effects, so that whenever I draw a specific Pendulum card, I have the choice where I put it, right? I think most Pendulums don't have that. Most Pendulums are like made to be a scale or made to be Pendulum summoned, not either. No, not both. Like the one perfect example of a card that I really loved is Archfiend Eccentric, like we've talked about before. That card, you read it and you're like, this card can definitely do both, right? I can scale this card, I can use it as a scale and then pop a back row. I can summon it, I can normal summon it to pop a monster. I can Pendulum summon it and then pop a monster afterwards. I can use it as a level 3 monster if I don't need to pop anything. It's just a very flexible card, right? It's not a broken card by any means, right? I'm not saying make the cards more broken. I'm just saying design them in a cooler way that they're actually flexible. Because in my opinion, when I look at Pendulum, that's the one thing that separates them from other cards, is that every card theoretically could have two purposes, right?
Different than other decks. Memorelia is another interesting concept. What if instead of the Pendulum Zone just being
cool
where
concept,
you put one monster that conceivably could have been part of a monster combo, it was a place where you put a little girl to sleep. And then she dreams about big-ass guys. Big-ass beefy fuckers. They hit hard. I like Nemorelia. It's very funny. The new Valmonica monsters are another incredible reimagining of what a pendulum is allowed to be. What if instead of just spaces in the back row, the pendulums represented the angel and the devil on your shoulder, and then you're in the middle making plays based on which one you listen to? Yu-Gi-Oh!
That deck seems cool. That deck genuinely seems nice in terms of a design.
Was a game that, for the majority of its lifespan, has been very...
But those are really... He's right on that. Those are the designs that make me look at the pendulum mechanic and I'm like, okay, I'm not completely sad that they made this mechanic, right? Like those... I don't know if those are good decks, specifically the Angel and Devil deck. When I read those cards, I was like, that's a cool use of the pendulum mechanic. That is a sick use of the pendulum mechanic. I like that. Right? And so I think they should just do more of that. I agree on that. I agree that they should make more unique pendulum archetypes that are not just like, yeah, I set up scales as efficiently as possible and pendulum summon as many dudes as possible to make whatever I can from the extra deck, right? I think they should make more stuff that just leans on the pendulum mechanic being very special rather than that.
Very derivative. It's largely retread a lot of ground that other card games like Magic the Gathering already started, which makes sense. Its genesis is in being a Magic the Gathering ripoff after all. But to me, pendulums represent one of the first opportunities for Yu-Gi-Oh! To do something uniquely different. It's a type of card that does not exist in any other card game, and almost cannot exist in any other card game. And it's frustrating that historically, it's been used to facilitate the same type of monster combos as every other deck. I really appreciate Konami's willingness to step outside of the box in terms of pendulum design and give us things that are more interesting and innovative than just setting up a silly Baron line. I enjoy that they're giving cards reasons to be pendulum, not just slapping the super type on a card and being like, ooh, now it works with amazing pendulum. Wow! To close this one out, I also think it would do a lot of good for the identity of Pendulum if a lot of the generic negation tools that lived in the extra deck just went away. Appaloosa isn't a particularly good card right now, but the fact that she exists means that decks like Pendulum that summon a bunch of monsters are always going to be considering her rather than their own in-archetype plays when they're deck building.
That's a whole nother discussion, right? And we've had it countless times here of like, at which point do we talk about hitting generic extra deck monsters simply because they end up in like every deck? I'm just not sure. I don't remember specifically. Appaloosa is a card that I don't remember the last time I thought Appaloosa was the big problem, right? I feel like Appaloosa it's a good card, but I hate to say it, but I feel like Appaloosa is fine. I think cards like Baron are I think Baron is something you could argue is a little bit obnoxious. Because Baron is just pretty much like, I mean, right? It's like, I don't know. In a vacuum, I think Baron is just a little bit too strong. And the problem that's one of the other problems with these synchro cards is like or like with these extra deck monsters, you don't really have a way to weaken them in any form, right? There's not really a way we could just make Baron weaker, right? We cannot limit Baron and that would be okay, right? We cannot semi-limit or limit anything. But as long as I feel like as long as Baron is around, every deck that has access to tuners is just gonna end on Baron, right? Like I can hardly imagine that there would be a way to make a better synchro, and I don't want to imagine a better synchro to end on than Baron the Fleur. Like I really don't want to even imagine that, right? Like it's kind of crazy. It's not even like, and that's the other thing to think about. It's not even like there is no other good level 10s to make, right? There's literally decks in which you could still easily end on Cheng Ying, you could still make Chaos Angel, you could still make the Ice Jade, you could make this Patter, you could make even, what's the other one? The other Sword Soul, see, evil Long Yuan guy. There's a lot of good level 10 synchros out there. It's not like if you ban Baron, synchro decks suddenly fall apart, right? Absolutely not the case, right? There's still very good options. It's just like everyone is doing Baron because Baron is an Omni Negate. What can be better than an Omni Negate most of the time, right? Like 99% of the time, an Omni Negate is just better. But if you banned Barone, there would be a lot of decks that would now go for Cheng Ying because they have Banish synergy. Or you go for the Ice Jade if that's better in your deck. Or you go for Chaos Angel if you want the protection from that. Or you go for whatever, right? Like, I think it would be more interesting if that card was banned. I personally am like kind of sick of seeing Baron in every single format, just in a slightly different shape or form, right? I don't know. But that's a whole different topic. The pendulum topic is interesting because I do genuinely feel like most of the good pendulum decks, and when I'm saying good pendulum decks, I don't mean Abyss Actors, right? Which that's the problem, right? A deck can be as well designed as you can possibly think of. Like, you know, it can be the best designed archetype ever. If it's not playable, that doesn't matter, right? It's just completely irrelevant. All of the relevant pendulum decks recently have not been very healthy for the game, I think, right? They have not been better or worse than any other combo deck, right? And so, like, you know, it's like, yeah, that's in general a problem sometimes, not all the time, but like, they should really design decks more. They should design more like unique pendulum decks, and they should make them just a little bit stronger. I think something like Nemleria or whatever, the mechanic is funny, but why did they make it so bad? You know, like that deck's not even close to playable. So that's weird. But anyways.